Content warning. This video contains disturbing real-life accounts from night shift workers. It may be unsettling or frightening for sensitive viewers. If you are under 18 or are easily frightened, please do not watch. You ever get that feeling? The one that crawls up the back of your neck at 3 a.m. when the store is dead quiet? That tells you something is wrong? Not the kind of wrong where you misplaced your keys or forgot to lock the front door. The kind of wrong that sits heavy in your chest. The kind that makes every shadow in your peripheral vision feel like it's breathing. Night shift workers know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you've never worked a graveyard shift in your life, consider yourself lucky. Because what you're about to read isn't fiction. These aren't campfire stories invented to frighten children. These are real accounts from real people who showed up to work, punched the clock, and came face to face with something they will never be able to fully explain or forget. I need you to stay with me here, because every single one of these stories starts the same way, completely ordinary. And that's what makes them so terrifying. The first story comes from a guy, let's call him Marcus, who spent his early 20s working the overnight shift at a large 24-hour retail superstore in rural Ohio. The kind of store that stretches half a city block, where the fluorescent lights hum like an old generator, and the aisles go on so long you lose sight of the other end. On a slow night, Marcus was the only employee in the building. Corporate didn't care. As long as the shelves got stocked, management was happy. There'd be maybe 6-7 customers all night, Marcus told me. Usually truckers grabbing coffee or people who just couldn't sleep. That was it. I'd spend most of the shift doing inventory in the back aisles. One particular winter night, Marcus was working through the cereal aisle, counting boxes, pulling product to the front of the shelves, when he heard something fall over on the other side of the shelving unit. A dull thud. The kind of sound a box makes when it slips off a shelf and lands flat on tile. He stopped. He hadn't heard the front doors slide open. Those doors were ancient and loud, a mechanical screech you'd hear from the break room. So there shouldn't have been anyone on that side of the store. He shrugged it off. Old buildings settle. Boxes fall on their own. He went back to counting, and then he looked up. At the end of the aisle, maybe 30 feet away, a man was standing completely still, just standing there, staring directly at Marcus with a blank, unreadable expression. Not shopping, not looking at products, just staring. The man looked to be in his mid-30s. There was something off about his face. Marcus struggled to describe it later, settling on wrong proportions, like the features didn't quite line up the way they should. His upper lip protruded slightly. Too far. His eyes were a little too wide. Not ugly, exactly, just wrong. "Can I help you find something?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level. The man blinked slowly. "No. Actually, could you just show me where the eggs are?" Marcus pointed him toward the dairy section at the back of the store, kept his head down, and finished the cereal aisle as fast as he could. He loaded up the stock cart and started pushing it toward the back storage room. He was halfway down the main aisle when the man appeared again, this time stepping out from the middle section, cutting Marcus off completely. "He just materialized," Marcus said, "like he'd been waiting." The man started talking. Cheerfully, almost. He asked Marcus his name, his age, whether he was in school, why he worked nights. Each question came quickly after the last, barely leaving room for an answer. Marcus answered in short sentences, kept moving, kept his hands on the cart. Then the questions shifted. Did Marcus go to parties? Did he have a girlfriend? Had he ever had a boyfriend? And as he asked that last question, the man placed his hand, slowly and deliberately, on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pushed the cart forward fast, breaking the contact, and walked at near-jogging pace all the way to the back storage room. He stood inside among the pallets and shelving units, heart slamming, listening for footsteps. The man did not follow him in. Policy said Marcus wasn't supposed to stay in the back room for long stretches, not with a customer loose in the store. Theft was always a concern, but Marcus wasn't ready to go back out there yet. He waited 15 minutes, then 20, then decided the man must have left. He waited another 5 just to be sure, then walked out to the registers to see if the man was checking out. The registers were empty. The store was silent. Marcus did a slow walk of the aisles, careful, methodical, and saw nothing. Whether the man had stolen something or simply walked out, Marcus couldn't say. He decided not to dwell on it. He needed to use the bathroom, and the urgency had been building for the last 20 minutes. The employee bathroom was at the very back of the store, past the stockroom, tucked into a hallway behind a door marked Staff Only. Marcus jogged back there, pushed through the door, and went into the single bathroom stall. He had barely sat down when he heard the outer door open. The sound hit him like ice water. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He thought about calling out, "Store's closed, you can't be in here," but something stopped him, something primal, something that said, "Don't let him know where you are." Marcus lifted his feet off the floor, tucked his knees up, made himself invisible from under the stall door. Silence. Then slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the tile. They stopped directly outside his stall. Marcus stared at the gap between the bottom of the stall door and the floor. He watched the shadow. He watched the feet. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He sat there for what felt like 10 full minutes, his thighs burning from holding his position, his entire body screaming at him to move or scream or do something. When he finally allowed himself to look up, slowly, carefully, he saw it. An eye, pressed to the vertical crack of the stall door. Watching him, Marcus screamed. It came out before he could stop it. In the same motion, his hand went to the box cutter he always kept clipped to his apron, and he shoved the blade through the crack of the door, forcing the man backward. In that half-second of space, Marcus threw the stall door open as hard as he could, the edge of it connecting with the man's face, and he ran. Through the bathroom, through the staff-only door, down the main aisle, and straight out the front entrance of the store into the freezing Ohio night. He called his manager from the parking lot, 5 times before he picked up. His manager told him to call the police. By the time the patrol car arrived, the man was long gone. Marcus worked 2 more night shifts at that store before requesting a transfer. He never saw the man again. But he never stopped checking the gap under bathroom stall doors. The second account comes from a woman named Dana, who worked the overnight shift at a small gas station on a desolate stretch of highway deep in rural Tennessee. Her hours were midnight to 6. Most nights, she saw fewer than a handful of customers. It was the kind of job that makes you feel like the last person on earth. Just you, the hum of the refrigerator units, the glow of the overhead lights in the parking lot, and miles of dark road in every direction. "The only reason I stayed," Dana told me, "was the pay bump. My manager gave me an extra $5 an hour to cover nights. I'd just paid off most of my student loans and was trying to build savings. It wasn't a great situation, but it worked." On a bone-cold night in early December. Dana was sitting behind the counter doing what she always did on slow nights, reading, scrolling through her phone, watching the highway through the window, when a pair of headlights pulled off the road and into the lot. A dark red pickup truck, the kind with a slightly raised frame and mud on the wheel wells, parked beside the gas pumps. The driver's door opened. A man climbed out. He was tall, well over 6 feet, in a heavy canvas jacket and work boots. He let the door swing shut behind him and walked around to the pump. Dana glanced up. Nothing unusual. She went back to her phone. A few minutes passed. She looked up again. He was still standing there, not pumping, not reading the instructions on the machine, just standing beside the pump with his hands loose at his sides, staring at it like he'd forgotten what he was supposed to do. He's confused, Dana thought. He probably can't figure out the card reader. She was about to get on the intercom to walk him through it when something stopped her. A feeling. A cold, slow pressure in her chest, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees inside the building. The man had turned his head. He was looking directly at her through the glass. She couldn't see his face clearly. The lot lighting was poor, and the distance between them, plus the glare on the window, made his features indistinct. But she could see his outline clearly enough, and she could see that he had stopped moving entirely. He wasn't leaning toward the pump. He wasn't reaching for his wallet. He was simply standing there, completely still, facing her direction. Dana looked back down at her phone, pretended she hadn't seen, pretended her pulse hadn't just doubled. When she looked up again, he was closer. Not at the pump, not walking toward the building, just standing still again. But now he was maybe 20 feet closer than before, still facing the window, still not moving. Dana stood up. She walked to the door. She turned the deadbolt. She flipped the open sign to closed, and then she walked back behind the counter and sat down on the floor, back against the cabinet, so she couldn't see, and couldn't be seen through, the front window. She pulled out her phone and started texting everyone she knew who might be awake at 1 in the morning, desperate to feel connected to another human being. She stayed on the floor for 5 minutes, then 10, then told herself she was being ridiculous and stood up to check. The man was at the door, not the pump, not the parking lot, right outside the door, close enough that if the glass hadn't been there, she could have touched him. His face was still unreadable, shadowed, features swallowed by darkness. He wasn't moving, he was just there. Dana grabbed the phone on the counter and called 911. The dispatcher was skeptical. No crime had been committed. A man standing outside a gas station wasn't technically illegal, but Dana kept her voice steady and kept talking, and eventually the dispatcher agreed to send a patrol unit. Dana got back on the floor. The knocking started softly. Regular, polite taps on the glass door. Then it escalated, not knocking anymore, but hitting, the whole door shuddering in its frame as the man threw his weight against it once, twice, 3 times. Dana pressed herself flat, both arms wrapped around her knees, phone clutched to her chest. Then it stopped. An engine turned over. Tires on gravel. Headlights sweeping across the ceiling as the truck pulled out of the lot and back onto the highway. 2 minutes later, a state trooper and a local patrol officer pulled in. Dana gave them the make of the truck and the direction it had gone. She couldn't describe the man's face. She genuinely couldn't remember a single distinct feature, just height, bulk, and darkness where a face should have been. The officers took her statement, did a sweep of the lot, and drove off. Dana quit 3 months later. She moved to Nashville and took a day shift at a cafe downtown. She still doesn't like sitting with her back to glass windows after dark. Some of the most unsettling encounters aren't about violence or even direct threat. Sometimes the thing that gets under your skin, the thing that stays with you for years, is something that doesn't fit into any category you have. Something you can't explain. Something that, no matter how many times you replay it, keeps generating new questions without ever providing answers. This next story is that kind. It was told to me by a man named Elliot, who spent 2 years working night shifts at a small convenience store in rural upstate New York. A 2-lane road, a dark parking lot, a walk-in cooler that rattled all night. The store sat at the intersection of a county highway and a state route, pulling in 15 to 20 customers between 10 at night and 4 in the morning. Mostly locals buying beer, chips, cigarettes, the usual. Elliot was 24 at the time, covering a shift for a co-worker who'd called out sick. "It was a normal night," he said, "until about 1 in the morning. The door opened and a man walked in. Mid-20s, Elliot estimated, though the guy had the kind of hollow, unfocused look that made age hard to pin down. He wasn't carrying anything. No wallet visibly in hand, no items pulled from the shelves. He walked up to the counter and stood there. Elliot looked up. "Hey, what can I get you?" The man didn't answer. He made a sound, a loud, formless vocalization that wasn't a word, not a grunt of confusion, not the beginning of a sentence, just a sound. Then another. Elliot paused. "Okay," Elliot said, quietly recalibrating. He thought of his younger cousin, who was nonverbal. He thought about what that felt like from the outside, how easy it was to misread. "No worries, man. Take your time." The man's head was tilted up toward the ceiling, eyes tracking something Elliot couldn't see. He kept making the sounds, intermittent, loud, formless, occasionally shifting his weight from foot to foot. Elliot glanced at the parking lot through the window. Empty, no car, no one waiting outside. This man had walked here, in the dark, alone. Elliot tried a few gentle approaches, pointed to things, showed him the snack shelf, asked if there was someone he could call. Each question produced only more sounds, no eye contact. After nearly 20 minutes of this, Elliot made a decision. He grabbed a bag of chips from the rack, walked around the counter, held them out, and said gently, "Hey, take these. You're good." He walked to the door and held it open. The man turned, walked out, disappeared into the dark. Elliot went back to the counter, sat down, and took a long breath. An hour passed. The phone rang. Elliot picked it up. "Thank you for calling. How can I—" The sounds came through the line. The same sounds, loud, formless, unmistakable. The exact voice from an hour ago. Elliot hung up, stood there, staring at the phone. His mind started running through explanations. Prank call, wrong number, coincidence, but none of them stuck. Who makes a prank call that sounds like that? And how would anyone know the store's number off the top of their head at 2 in the morning? He checked the lot through every window, checked the door, checked the lot again. Nothing. At 4 a.m. his relief arrived, and Elliot drove home through the dark. He was barely through his front door, coat still on, keys still in hand, when his cell phone rang. He answered without thinking. The sounds came through the speaker, loud, right against his ear, in his home. Elliot said he felt his body go cold from the inside out. Not a chill from the air, but a cold that started in his stomach and radiated outward. He threw the phone down, locked every door in the apartment, pulled every blind, and sat in the middle of his bedroom floor, with every light on, listening to the silence of his apartment until he was satisfied that it was only silence and nothing else. He tried to convince himself it was over, and for weeks it seemed like it was. The calls stopped. The man never came back to the store. Life returned to normal. Elliot started sleeping with the lights off again. He stopped flinching every time the phone rang. Then, about a month later, he needed something from his basement. He hadn't been down there in weeks. It was just a storage space, mostly boxes of old clothes and equipment from a previous apartment. He pulled the chain on the overhead bulb, and in the yellow light he saw that the floor was covered in scattered papers. His papers Documents, old mail, printed photos, spread across the concrete like someone had gone through them carefully and then spread them out to look at everything at once. Elliot stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time. Then he opened the door to the basement closet. On the wall, in black marker, the name of the convenience store, where he worked, written out in full. Below it, the store's address. Below that, his address, the address of the apartment he was standing in right now. Beside the writing, arranged on the floor of the closet, a row of kitchen knives, steak knives, a chef's knife, and a heavy folding blade with a worn wooden handle, laid out neatly, like they'd been placed there with intention. The man had been in his home. Not once, briefly, on accident. He'd been there long enough to write on the walls, to arrange objects, to learn Elliot's home address, and write it beside the store address as if cross-referencing two locations in a plan. For how long, Elliot couldn't say. He called the police that night. They took photos, filed a report, and told him to change his locks and call back if the man returned. He never did. Elliot moved out within the week. He still doesn't know how the man got in, how long he'd been coming and going, or what stopped him. "I think about it sometimes," Elliot told me. "What if he hadn't stopped? What if I'd come home on the wrong night?" He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. There is a particular kind of darkness unique to rural America at night, the kind you only truly understand if you've worked in it. Not the cozy darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, or the comfortable darkness of a movie theater. This is the darkness of open fields and empty highways, where the nearest town is 20 minutes away, and the nearest person might be further. The kind of darkness where sound carries differently, where distance feels different, where you become acutely aware of just how alone you actually are. The next story comes from that darkness. Her name was Renee, and she worked dispatch and field support for a rural county sheriff's department in central Georgia. For 9 years, she worked graveyard. She'd seen things that would curl your hair, accidents, domestic calls, the full catalog of what people do to each other in the dark. But she told me there is one night she will never speak about in full. What she was willing to share, she shared with the clear understanding that she would stop when she chose to. She and her dog, a German shepherd named Atlas, 3 years old, trained for search and detection, were running patrol on a stretch of county road, bordered by farmland on both sides, when she spotted a white cargo van sitting on the shoulder of the road, partially tucked into a break between the fields. Both rear doors were hanging open, no hazard lights, no one visible. Renee ran her plates. Nothing came back immediately. She pulled up behind it, put her lights on, and waited. No movement. She put it on the radio, requested a check, and when no one came out after a full 90 seconds of lights and radio chatter, she got out and took Atlas with her. "He knew something was wrong before I did," she told me. "He started pulling before we even reached the back of the van. I had to use both hands on, the leash." Renee described what she found in the back of the van as something she was not prepared for by any training she had ever received. She reached the open rear doors, and Atlas went absolutely haywire. Not the focused alert of a working dog who has found something, but the full-body, uncontrolled reaction of an animal encountering something its instincts have no framework for. She looked inside. 7 body bags, lined up along the floor of the van's cargo area, each one zipped, each one still, each one with the lower portion of 2 feet visible below the zipper line, the soles of shoes facing upward. Renee called for backup immediately. She had both hands on the radio when she heard something in the field to her right, a single dry crack, like a branch under a foot. Atlas tore the leash out of her grip and disappeared into the crops. She drew her weapon and followed the sound of his barking, pushing through row after row of dried corn stalks that slapped her face and caught her sleeves. Atlas's barking got louder, then suddenly stopped, and in the silence that followed, Renee realized she could hear movement, not from one direction, from several directions at once. Slow, deliberate movement, circling in the dark around her. She stopped moving. The movement around her slowed and then stopped too, as though whatever was out there was listening, mirroring her. She stood completely still in the middle of the field, gun raised, unable to see more than 3 feet in any direction. Then 2 arms closed around her throat from behind. She couldn't scream. She couldn't get her gun up. She felt the pressure build against her airway, felt her vision starting to narrow from the edges inward, felt her legs going soft. And then, Atlas. The bark came first. Then the sound of the attacker's voice breaking into a scream. The grip on her throat released. Renee spun, weapon up, and fired once. She didn't stay to assess the outcome. She grabbed Atlas's collar and she ran. Back through the corn, back to the road, back to her cruiser. She could hear movement behind her. Multiple people, multiple directions. But she didn't turn around. She got Atlas in the car, got herself in, and drove. She put a 1/4 mile between herself and that van before she stopped shaking enough to get back on the radio. Backup arrived in under 6 minutes. The van was gone. The road was empty. Renee hadn't managed to capture a plate number, not on dash cam, not written down, not from memory. The cornfield was searched and yielded nothing. A team walked the area at first light and found footprints, evidence of disturbance, and a small amount of blood, where Renee said she'd fired. Nothing else. No van, no plates, no bodies, no names. "I ran," she told me. "I know what I'm supposed to do. I know what I trained for. And I ran." She said it without self-pity, but without absolution either. Just the flat, even delivery of someone who has spent years sitting with a decision they made in the dark, wondering if they would make it again. "She would," she said. "She's not sorry about it. But she thinks about that van, about those 7 bags, about whoever was in them, and whether they were ever found, and whether anyone ever came looking. She thinks about it every night. Some of the people who work the night shift do so because they have no other choice. Student loans, rent, a sick parent, a second job to cover what the first one doesn't. They aren't looking for anything unusual. They aren't the type to see shadows where there aren't any. They're just showing up, clocking in, and trying to get through 8 hours so they can go home and sleep before doing it again. And then, one night, without warning, everything changes. This account comes from a college student named Theo, 20 years old, who worked the overnight shift at a roadside diner off the interstate in rural Virginia. His shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 5 nights a week. It was exhausting, relentless work, the kind that leaves you running on fumes by Wednesday and completely hollowed out by Saturday. But the tips on the late-night crowd were good, and Theo needed every dollar he could get. It was mostly truckers, he told me, guys coming in for pie and black coffee at 2 in the morning. I liked them, honestly. Low maintenance, they just wanted to sit in peace and eat. One Tuesday in November, Theo was in the middle of a dead stretch, nothing between midnight and 2, just him and the cook, who had retreated to the back to catch 40 minutes of sleep on the break room couch. Theo was wiping down tables when the bell above the door jingled and a woman walked in. She looked to be in her 50s, sharp-featured, thin, wearing a long gray coat despite the fact that it wasn't particularly cold out. She sat down at the counter without looking at the menu, without taking her coat off, and folded her hands in front of her. Theo walked over, "Hey, what can I get you?" The woman looked at him and smiled. It was a normal smile, polite, appropriate. But something about it, something he still can't put into words, made the hair on his arms stand up. "Just water," she said. Theo got her water. She didn't touch it. She sat there for the next 40 minutes without ordering anything else, without using her phone, without reading, without doing anything at all, except sitting perfectly upright on the counter stool with her hands folded and occasionally glancing toward the windows that faced the parking lot. Theo watched her from the corner of his eye while he pretended to be busy. At one point she turned her head and caught him looking. She smiled again, that same smile, and turned back toward the window. At about 2:30, Theo decided to ask if she needed anything. He walked to the counter, picked up a pad, started to open his mouth. "He'll be here in about 15 minutes, she said. Theo paused. "Sorry?" "The man I'm waiting for," she said. "He'll be here in about 15 minutes. He always is." Theo nodded slowly. "Okay." She was waiting for someone. That was normal. People did that. He walked back to the far end of the counter and pretended to check something near the register. 14 minutes later, the bell above the door jingled again. A man walked in, 6 feet tall, dark jacket. He didn't look left or right. He walked directly to the counter and sat down next to the woman, who had not turned to watch him come in. He sat down beside her, and they turned to face each other, and they began talking in low voices, calm, unhurried, the way old friends talk when they have all the time in the world. Theo told himself it was nothing, told himself he'd built a story around a woman waiting for her husband or her brother or an old friend from out of town. Then he overheard a single sentence, not eavesdropping, just a phrase that carried across the quiet diner in the way sound carries in the dead of night, and his stomach dropped. He heard the man say, quietly and without inflection, "And the boy by the register. Does he know?" Theo did not move. He kept his eyes on the counter in front of him, kept his expression neutral, kept his breathing even. He heard the woman respond in a voice that was just slightly too low for him to catch. He heard the man exhale, a long, measured exhale through the nose, and then silence. When Theo finally looked up, the 2 stools were empty. The woman's water glass was still on the counter, untouched. There were 2 $5 bills beside it. Exact change for a glass of water, as though they had known the cost before sitting down. Theo went to the door and looked out at the lot. Empty, no car, no taillights receding down the highway. Nothing. He locked the diner door, woke the cook, and spent the next 4 hours sitting in the kitchen waiting for his shift to end. He never worked the night shift at that diner again. He asked to be moved to the lunch shift within the week. He still thinks about what the man said. Does he know? Theo says he doesn't know what he was supposed to know. He says he hopes he never finds out. Not every night shift story ends with the threat walking away. Some of them stay with you in a different way. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. Because of the moment where the universe offered a different outcome than the one you got, and you understood, clearly, completely, how thin the line is. This account comes from a man who asked to remain unnamed. He worked night security at a large industrial facility in western Pennsylvania, a manufacturing plant that ran around the clock, though the night skeleton crew was small. His job was to walk the perimeter, monitor the access points, and respond to any alarms or irregularities. Mostly boring, mostly nothing. On a clear night in October, he was doing his exterior walk when he noticed a panel on the north fence line was hanging open, not cut, just unlatched, as though someone had come through and hadn't bothered to close it behind them. He called it in, got a copy to respond from inside, and began walking the perimeter of the lot to see if anyone was still on the property. He found the man crouched behind the loading dock, barely visible in the shadow between two parked delivery trucks. He had a flashlight in one hand and what looked like a length of cable or rope in the other. When the beam of the officer's flashlight hit him, he stood up immediately. He was calm, completely calm. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just straightened up and looked at the officer. "Can I help you?" the officer said. "Which is a ridiculous thing to say," he acknowledged later, "but sometimes your training takes over." The man said nothing. He looked at the officer for a long moment. Then he looked down at the cable in his hand. Then he looked back at the officer, and then he smiled. Not a threatening smile, not a manic smile, just a smile. The smile of a man who has made a decision, and then he dropped the cable, stepped over it, and walked toward the open fence panel. He didn't run. He walked, unhurried, unbothered, completely at ease. The officer followed, calling for backup. The man walked through the fence panel and into the empty lot on the other side. By the time backup arrived, he was gone. The cable was still on the ground by the loading dock. The officer never found out who he was or what he'd planned. "The smile," he told me. "That's the part I can't shake. The smile wasn't nervous. It wasn't angry. It was like he already knew how everything was going to go, like he'd already seen it, and he was fine with it." He requested a transfer to day security 6 weeks later. Before the last story, and the last story is the one that I have been circling back to since the beginning, the one that earns the warning at the top of this piece, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. Most of the people who shared these accounts did so reluctantly. Some of them asked for names to be changed. Some of them have never told these stories to anyone except the people who were there. Not because they're embarrassed, but because talking about it makes it real again in a way that costs them something. Night shift workers are one of the most overlooked populations in this country. They keep the hospitals running, the highways stocked, the emergency lines open. They sit alone in booths and behind counters in the dead of night so that the rest of us can sleep undisturbed. And they see things, strange things, frightening things, things that exist in the margins of daylight where most people never look. The least we can do is listen. The final story in this collection was told to me by a woman named Carla, who spent 11 years working the night shift in a long-term care facility in central Illinois, the kind of place where people go when they cannot live alone anymore, when age or illness or injury has narrowed the world down to a room, a bed, a window. She had worked there since her late 20s. She was good at her job, patient, intuitive, unflappable, in the way that only people who have spent years sitting with suffering tend to become. She told me she had a rule about night shifts. You don't get rattled by things you can't explain, because if you got rattled, you couldn't do your job. She had seen plenty in 11 years. She had seen people pass in the night without a sound, and people pass loudly after weeks of fighting. She had seen things move in her peripheral vision that weren't there when she turned to look. She had heard her name called from empty rooms. She had learned to keep walking. But there is one night she can't walk past. It was February, the dead of winter, a Tuesday or Wednesday. She doesn't remember which, only that the week had been brutally cold, and the facility's heating system had been fighting to keep up. Her unit had 14 residents. 4 of them were in various stages of cognitive decline. One of them, room 7, a man she called Mr. C, had been declining more sharply in recent months. Some nights he was lucid and charming. Other nights he didn't know where he was or what year it was, called out for people who had been dead for decades and needed to be gently redirected for hours. On this particular night, room 7 was quiet. Carla had checked on Mr. C at midnight, found him asleep, and moved on. At 2 a.m., she was at the nurse's station at the end of the hall when she heard his call light go on. She walked down the hall and pushed the door open. Mr. C was sitting up in bed, fully upright, which was unusual. He tended to list to one side when he sat up unsupported. He was looking directly at the door, directly at her, with an expression she had never seen on his face in 11 years of working with residents at end of life. Total clarity. "He looked at me the way you'd look at someone you've been waiting for," Carla said. "Like he knew exactly who I was and why I was there. His eyes were just sharp." "Clear." Carla came in, checked his vitals, asked if he needed anything. He shook his head. He was looking past her, toward the door, toward the hallway beyond. "Someone's here," he said. Carla turned. The hallway was empty. "There's nobody in the hallway, Mr. C," she said. "Not in the hallway," he said. He gestured, a slow, deliberate motion with one hand, toward the window. "Out there." She looked. The window faced the parking lot, which was lit by a single pole light about 30 yards from the building. The lot was empty. Nothing moved. Beyond the lot, the road was dark. She told him everything was fine. She told him it was the middle of the night and she was just down the hall. She turned to go. "She's been waiting a long time," he said. "She's tired." Carla stopped. "Who is?" she asked. Mr. C looked at her with that same clear, unhurried expression. He said a name, a woman's name, one that Carla did not recognize. He said it with absolute certainty, the way you'd say the name of someone standing in the room. Carla said good night, went back to the nurse's station, and sat quietly for a few minutes. She told herself it was a lucid dream, a fragment of an old memory, the kind of things that happen with cognitive decline. She told herself it was meaningless. She pulled up Mr. C's intake records. She wasn't sure why, just felt the pull of it, and scrolled through his family history, his emergency contacts, his biographical information. The name he had said, the woman's name, was the name of his wife. She had passed away 14 years earlier. Carla sat with that for a long time in the quiet of the nurse's station, the building humming around her, the hallway stretching out to her left toward 14 closed doors. At 4 a.m., Room 7's vitals monitor alarmed. Mr. C passed at 4:12 a.m. with no family present. Carla was with him. "I held his hand," she said. "I just held his hand." She doesn't tell this story very often. She doesn't offer explanations for it. She doesn't say it proves anything or means anything in any particular direction. She just says, it happened. She was there. She will not pretend otherwise. I asked her if she was afraid that night. She thought about it for a while. "Not of him," she said, "and not of her if she was there. I was just aware, really aware, of how thin everything is, how close together all these things are that we think are so separate." She paused. "Night shift does that to you," she said. "You start to feel where the edges are." There is a version of each of these stories that gets explained away. The man at the supercenter was mentally unstable and found his way into the employee bathroom by accident. The figure at the gas station was a confused stranger who drove off when he couldn't get in. The man in the basement was a vagrant who found an unlocked door. The van in the cornfield was a crime that simply never got solved. The couple in the diner were eccentric travelers who said something ambiguous that sounded more sinister than it was. The security guard saw a trespasser who thought better of whatever he'd planned, and the old man in room 7 spoke a name from his past because memory works in strange and non-linear ways, especially at the end. All of these explanations are available, and they may be correct, but the people who lived these nights don't lean on explanations. They don't need the stories to mean something supernatural in order to carry them. What they carry is simpler than that. The knowledge that between midnight and morning, in the places where the world is quiet and the lights are sparse and the nearest person is a long way away, things happen. Things that don't always resolve, things that don't always make sense, things that leave a mark. The night shift asks something of the people who work it. It asks for a particular kind of courage, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that photographs well, but the quiet kind, the kind that involves showing up alone to an empty building at midnight, doing your job, and not falling apart when something goes wrong. Most of them manage it. All of them remember. If you've made it to the end of this, if you've stayed with these people through their worst nights, then you understand why they tell these stories. It's not for the fear. It's not for the thrill. It's because these things happen to them, and they're still here, and they need someone to know. So now you know. Sleep well.